The large portrait behind me is of George Calvert, who built Kiplin Hall in the early 1620s. The painting is by the court artist Daniel Mytens. Well, it's a copy of the original. The original was commissioned by the Earl of Strafford, who was a great friend of George Calvert's, and he owned Wentworth Woodhouse in South Yorkshire. This copy was commissioned in 2000 by a direct descendant of George Calvert. She was 11 generations down the line and was sad that we didn't have a portrait of her illustrious ancestor. George was born here at Kiplin in 1579, and his parents were Roman Catholic at a time when Parliament was trying to stamp out Catholicism in the north of England. His father converted, his mother wasn't quite so sure, and she wanted to remain a Catholic. So George and his younger brother Christopher, they were educated in a Protestant household in Bilton, which is a village near York. It must have been very difficult to be taken away from their parents at such a young age. Because George was brought up a Protestant, he was able to go to court eventually and was able to rise through the ranks. As a Catholic, that would have been very difficult for him. In 1603, he became the private secretary to Sir Robert Cecil, who was one of the two principal secretaries of state to King James I. In the same year that he was knighted, in 1619, George Calvert bought 800 acres of land and the original manor house here, and then in the following year began to build Kiplin Hall itself. There was no architect for it. It was quite common not to have an architect at that time. Often the owner and the master builder just discussed it together. But he was at court during the great Jacobean building boom. He knew about the latest fashions in architecture. And because his patron at court was Sir Robert Cecil, he will have seen Cecil building Hatfield House in Hertfordshire with its red brick and its towers and ogee domes. He also probably knew Kiplin Hall in Norfolk, which was built for Sir Henry Hubbard. And they are typical Jacobean houses, much larger than Kiplin, but there are definitely similarities. George Calvert followed the fashion and used red brick. It would have been cheaper probably to use Yorkshire stone, and there are Yorkshire stone decorations on the corners of the house and around the front door, but it's basically brick. It's very tall, it's almost square, very symmetrical, but just slightly rectangular, and it has towers on the centre of the four sides. Now this is very unusual. Jacobean and Elizabethan houses often had towers with ogee domes, but they're normally on the four corners of the house. If they're on the centre of the sides, it's very practical. You get extra space in your rooms, and also the staircases could be put into the north and south tower. Having four towers on the centre of each of the sides also, of course, gives the house a cross shape, especially if you're looking from the air, which of course you couldn't do in those days. So it was secret, and perhaps was an indication that George was thinking of going back to becoming a Catholic. Looking at the front of the house also, there is diapering, that's a diamond-shaped pattern in blue-black bricks, which lifts the facade, and it actually gives it a very attractive, symmetrical shape. As well as working at court and building Kiplin, George Calvert was also very interested in founding colonies in the New World. And in 1620, he founded one in Newfoundland, which he called Avalon. I don't think it was like Avalon at all, because he sent settlers over there. It was a very, very hard life, and letters were written back saying how incredibly harsh the climate was and how difficult it was to make things grow, because the soil was frozen for about 8 months of the year. But he persevered, and he spent a lot of money supporting the colony, about £25,000 at the time, which in today's money is about 2.5 million. At court you could make a lot of money, but that really is a considerable sum to spend. We were very lucky in 2016 to be able to buy a letter written by George Calvert in November 1622 from his address in St Martin's Lane in London. At this time he was building Kiplin, the colony of Avalon was going on, but this is all about politics. It was written to the Marquis of Buckingham, he hadn't become Duke at that stage, and it's all about what is now the history of the day, the people, the wars. What they didn't know was the start of the 30 Years' War. The fall of Mannheim is in here. He talks about the match, and that was the proposed marriage of the Prince of Wales, who later Charles I, with the Spanish Infanta, the Habsburg Spanish Infanta. At that stage, the European countries and states were very much arranged against each other, the Protestants and the Catholics. So it is an incredible political letter, and there are many other people and places named within it. But it's so nice to see George's incredibly illegible handwriting. James I even told him that his handwriting looked from afar as fair as any man's, but when one came close, one could not read a single word. And it is very difficult, but it does start, "May it please your lordship." And on page 3, it's one of these folded letters. It actually is signed GEO, is short for George, so GEO Calvert, and a scribble for Esquire at the end. And the address is very clear, St Martin's Lane, the 12th of November, 1622. We had funding from the Friends of the National Libraries and also from Kiplin's friends in this country and in America. So it was a fantastic addition to Kiplin's archives. George Calvert had been born a Catholic but brought up as a Protestant, and as he got older he wanted to go back to his original religion. He couldn't stay at court, he felt, so he declared his Catholicism in 1625. But because he had been such a loyal subject to the king, James I gave him lands in Ireland, where it was cheap to give land away. He gave him land in County Longford in central Ireland, and created him the first Baron Baltimore, named after a tiny hamlet within County Longford. In the winter of 1627 to 28, George Calvert took his family across to Avalon because, of course, it was his own colony and there was religious toleration. But when he got there, he discovered that, in fact, the climate was unbearably harsh and he felt he couldn't stay there, and left the colonists to get on with it. But he is still remembered in the capital, Ferryland, and there's a museum there. And when some excavations were done several years ago, they found the remains of George's manor house over there. In 1628, he decided he would try Virginia because he also owned land there. But when he was asked to swear the oath of loyalty to the king as head of the true church, as a Catholic, he felt that he couldn't do that. And so the Virginian House of Burgesses rebuffed him. And he travelled back to England. And by this stage, Charles I was on the throne. And he petitioned Charles for what he called lands in a more congenial climate. After some negotiation, Charles agreed, and he was given land near what is Washington today, called Maryland now, but at that time it was called Terra Mariae, the land of Mary, and Charles I had named it after his French queen, Henrietta Maria. Sadly, George Calvert died in 1632, just about 6 weeks before Charles I put his seal on the Charter of Maryland. So it was his sons who actually colonised their new lands over in America. His son Cecil was the second Lord Baltimore. He remained in England as the proprietor of Maryland, and he sent his younger brother Leonard over in 1633 with 150 settlers and 50 sailors. They left from the Isle of Wight in November, and they travelled on 2 little ships called the Ark and the Dove. Now, the Ark was the larger wooden ship. It was 125 feet long, and there were about 150, 160 people on board the ship. The Dove was only 49 feet and also a little wooden boat crossing the Atlantic, and it carried most of their supplies, their tools, their seeds, items for trading with the indigenous people when they got there. But the Dove disappeared in the Bay of Biscay in a great storm, and the Ark went on alone. And fortunately, the Dove caught up with them in Barbados, and they must have been absolutely delighted that the people were safe and all their goods were safe as well. In Maryland, there's still a Society of the Ark and the Dove, and they are direct descendants of those sailors who travelled over on those 2 little ships, and they have to prove that they're direct descendants. They are very proud of their ancestry. Part of the rent for Maryland, which had to be paid by the Calverts. Rather strangely, it was 2 arrows made by the Native American people. And the Lords Baltimore provided those for many years, sent them over to the Crown, but they also had to give them a percentage of any gold or precious metals that was found, which would have been a lot more lucrative than just 2 arrows. The map on the wall was painted by students from the School of Architecture at the University of Maryland in the 1980s and shows the voyage that the settlers took in 1633 from the Isle of Wight right across to Maryland. This little model of either the Ark or the Dove, it's not entirely clear which it is, was commissioned by Bridget Talbot in 1947 and then later used in one of her pageants about the settling of Maryland. She was the last owner of Kiplin Hall, who died in 1971. There's still a very close connection between Kilpin and Maryland, and a lot of people come over to see the ancestral home of their families. And there's also in the grounds at Kiplin Hall, in the old home farm, the Maryland Study Centre, where students come and stay here, and they've been coming here every year since 1987, and we're always delighted to welcome them.